It's with great pleasure that I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. V. Geeta. Dr. V. Geeta is a writer historian and a feminist and has written various works on issues regarding caste, gender, education, and civil rights. Post her graduation, she has also been actively involved in the women's movement for a decade. Some of her published works involved Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar and Question of Socialism in India, and Undoing Impunity, Speech After Sexual Violence. She has also been involved in translating some of the works of authors like Dr. Perumal Murugan. So once again, I welcome you, ma'am, to for this talk today. Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah. So I will just give an intro to today's talk. Also, looking at the very title, not necessarily easy to comprehend that what we are going to look at, and it's definitely a very fascinating, interesting theme, particularly those who are working on intersectionalities of caste and gender. So compulsory heterosexism, marital rape, honor killings, sex selective abortions, enforced pregnancies and enforced abortions, dowry violence, domestic violence, all the forms of violence on women has roots in the kind of patriarchy that women in Hindu community encounter. So the crux of Hindu community is nothing but this caste endogamous marriage. The aim of marriage is reproduction. And so this reproduction that is placed within the caste endogamous marriage is nothing but the reproduction of caste and caste inequalities itself. So marriage is not meant for a companionship, friendship, or reproduction, but reproduction. And therefore, solemnization of most marriages doesn't end without the obligatory ritualistic cohabitation, which effectively communicates to women what are the confines of within which her sexuality and reproduction is active. In other words, that she cannot cohabitate outside the domestic sphere of this marriage. Unfortunately, this is the reason behind regulation of sexuality of women even before marriage. So family, this regulation takes place by family to caste groups, and thus parental love necessarily includes killing of the child in certain conditions in Hindu society. So keeping this intro in mind, I invite Vigita ma'am to speak on thinking social reproduction.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saujanya, for inviting me to give this talk. This is something that many of us in women's movements, in women's studies, and in various people's movements have constantly debated and discussed amongst ourselves. And we have also discussed this in the context of urgent issues and concerns raised by working class women, by Dalit women, Adivasi women, by minority women, and increasingly over the last decade or so by persons in queer movements who have pushed us to rethink the relationship between sex, gender, class, caste, and faith. So thinking social reproduction is quite a challenge in view of the many axes along which we need to plot our understanding. But interestingly enough, scholarship also in these diverse areas is growing. And what I want to do today is to share a method of reading basically with all of you. How might we think social reproduction through texts that have emerged at different points in time? And how might we read a particular text, both in terms of its own content and in terms of how it relates or could be made to relate to various other texts. And as you can see from the little note that I have put up here, I'm going to be looking at feminist scholarship that has emerged over the last 30 to 50 years and across disciplinary boundaries, though I might not necessarily look at each and every discipline that I have listed here. But it seems to me that one of the more challenging and also interesting tasks that we can set ourselves as feminist scholars is to see how we make certain disciplines speak to certain other disciplines, and also certain writings speak to certain other writings. And if we do that, what is it that we then need to sort of work with? Because then you can curate or plot different kinds of conversations in ways that open up the fields of caste, labor, gender, and the social order for all of us invested in a transformative politics. And I think such opening up will help us also think of the many contexts from within which we need to effect this challenge. So that's one of the contexts in which my talk is based today. So I want to start with looking at something that is something that Saujanya wrote a few years ago, where she speaks of the relationship between patriarchy and caste. In a sense, of course, it seems a bit repetitive to say patriarchy and caste, because in the Indian context, one cannot envision or define patriarchy and caste independent of each other. So in other words, caste is constitutively patriarchal and patriarchy is constitutively composed of elements that form the caste order. So in that sense, one cannot separate patriarchy from caste. And this is something that has been most forcefully put forward by feminists from different contexts, but particularly by Dalit feminists. And this is an extra short extract from one of Saujanya's essays. Some of you might be familiar with it. But basically, it calls attention to the fact that social subordination of entire communities is also premised on the fact of sexual and gender subordination within communities, and that one needs to sort of attend to both axes of subordination. And how might we do that fruitfully, productively, and how might we all be invested in a universal politics of liberation? So this is a challenge that you see is before us, and I think Saujanya has put it very clearly and very carefully as well in this extract from an essay written several years ago. I then want us to look at this note, which was put out in the heyday of Me Too, 7-8 years ago, where there was a sense of indignation and anger. And in that context, this group, Dalit Women Fight, put out this note on how we might have to have a shared investment in challenging caste, because one cannot call out sexual exploitation without simultaneously asking ourselves, where are we located in this very complex prism of oppression and exploitation, and how some of us might be implicated in those very contexts that we imagine exploit us. So I think that is a challenge that this quotation sort of brought into the public domain several years ago. And I wanted to start with this because of various reasons, some of which are very existential. We're all sort of deeply anguished by events around us continuously, and the most recent being the video from Manipur. And this, of course, is not exceptional. We've seen such things happen in other contexts in the Northeast, but also elsewhere in the country. Karalanji in Maharashtra being the most sort of ocular example of a spectacle of violence that was also an assertion of caste power. So in the Northeast, again, you see a similar sort of a spectacle where, in order to assert the right of community, women's bodies are viewed as disposable, as violable, and so on. So in that context, we need to sort of ask some fundamental questions about the relationship of bodily integrity to the integrity of communities. And while this is not specific to the Indian context, it is a phenomenon that we see across the world. For those of us who are familiar with the horrors perpetrated in Bosnia, for example, we know how this unfolded. We also know of the deeply tragic circumstances in which women were hurt and mutilated in the war in Rwanda. So this is not specific to India. But what is specific to India is what one might call a graded system of violability. So some bodies are considered constitutively violable. You can violate them with impunity. Whereas other bodies are seen as repositories of purity. So to violate them would constitute a deep offense, both social and cultural offense. And the tragedy for all of us who view ourselves as women is that our lives and bodies are deeply implicated in this process of sexual differentiation between female bodies and other bodies that are violable and bodies that are not violable or whose violation won't be tolerated. And I think when we think social reproduction, we also need to think how the system of graded violability is also reproduced as part of reproducing the caste order. So it is in that sense when Dalit women fight say that the dismantling of caste power is something that each of us needs to be invested in. I think that that is not simply a question of owning up to caste or adopting an intersectional framework for epistemological reasons, but also to have a deeply invested ontological stake in challenging caste. Because caste is about being and bodies as well, in as much as it is about other things. So I think that's something that I wanted to start with. And you'll notice that the brief note that I had sent, whoever's had the opportunity to see it, that I wanted to start by saying, let's start this conversation with that famous essay by Uma, Conceptualizing Brahmanical Patriarchy, which was published exactly 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with it, or if you're not, you must have heard of it at least. Uma Chakravarti, professor of history at that time in Miranda House, and then later on, of course, she went on to do other things. But she wrote this very important essay. It was published in the EPW, basically saying what and I've just extracted 2 sections from that essay, basically pointing to the lacuna in terms of how caste and gender are not made to be in conversation with each other. Those who are invested in caste seldom study gender, and gender, those who study gender or feminists do not see caste as a valuable and elemental analytical category to understand their own oppression. And why is that important? Why must we therefore see the caste gender axis for what it is? And Uma goes on to say, drawing evidence from several texts from what we all call ancient India, which is basically anything from the Rig Veda to the Buddha's time. Basically, how and at what point in history did women come to be subordinated, and how that subordination was put in place through a regulation of female sexuality along lines of Varna to start out with, and how that regulation subsequently reproduced itself in different parts, in different moments in our history. Uma doesn't go into the rest of history. She situates her argument within ancient India. But what I want us to notice is what I have highlighted in red. She has quoted she cites 2 scholars there, Kamala Ganesh, sociologist, and Veena Das, sociologist, anthropologist. And I want us to take note of this because the point about Uma's essay is not that she was the first to be making these connections, or that feminists or others have not spoken of caste and gender. And they have spoken of caste and gender. And the decades before, starting from the late 60s, there have been attempts to think of caste and gender in different ways, in different disciplines, in anthropology, sociology, and history. And equally, there have been struggles on the ground where, whether one willed it or not, a struggle against, say, oppression in agrarian Andhra Pradesh or in Bihar had to necessarily combine struggles against caste-based servitude as well as issues of class. I don't think it was a theoretical choice. The realities of our lives are such that one cannot challenge relations of production without simultaneously challenging their being embedded within a caste structure. So you see that in all these struggles, whether in Naxalbari, though often the literature tends to focus on middle-class expressions, those that began the struggle in the village of Naxalbari were undercaste laborers and Adivasi laborers, women. So these were the segments of our population that were constantly in revolt through the 60s and 70s, whether it's in the East or whether it's in various peasant and plantation worker struggles in the South. If you think of Kyui Wenmani in 1968, there was an entire decade and a half leading to that horrific event, where you see Dalit women being organized as part of wider struggles against an entrenched landlord system. And then in Maharashtra, you have the Namantar movement, as many of you know, the renaming of Marathwada University as Baba Sahib Ambedkar University, and the violence that resulted as a consequence, and the emergence of feminist groups in and through that process. And the Srikakulam Girijan struggles in the late 60s and early 70s, which saw subaltern Adivasis in revolt. So the period before Uma's text was published in EPW also was a period where we see the visibility of Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi women in struggle. And while we may not have a clear and coherent sense of their voices, though in some instances there have been attempts to capture those voices, we know that they were standing up for rights that they could not separate as economic rights, social rights, and cultural rights. This was a bundle of rights that constituted them as rights-bearing, self-respecting subjects. So they were speaking and fighting in the name of these multiple rights. And interestingly, during the same period, you have a sort of constant writing on caste, class, and gender across domains and by several scholars, foremost among whom was Gail Omweth, whose pathbreaking book, We Shall Smash This Prison, was based on work that she undertook in Maharashtra in the early 1970s, when there was a cluster of left uprisings. There was also the drought, there was food shortages, there was a Namantar movement. So she was sort of weaving herself in and out of these various places of protest. And she wrote this remarkable book called We Shall Smash This Prison, where she very in a very almost unself-conscious way points to the fact that the struggles that we see all around us cannot be easily separated from each other, and that the challenge is to conceptually pull them all together. And how does one do that? And Gail was working within a paradigm where the Marxist understanding of social reproduction theory was in the forefront. And she herself was a product of the student and civil rights revolt in the United States. So there was that constant arguing with the global left on how might we situate women's subordination, how do you understand social reproduction. And here she was in India with a mandate to study women's movements. And she wrote a remarkable amount of text during that period on women's movements, on feminism. And she was struck by the reality of caste-based oppression. And she saw how futile it would be to fold that into a class-based understanding of society. It required its own theorization. And Gail would go on to talk about it for the rest of her life in different ways, largely as a historian and as a political commentator. While she did not work with a broad conceptual feminist framework at all times, her writing comprises several constituents which feminists should perhaps make better use of than they are doing at present, and which would really help us bring together on board several issues to do with social reproduction, which is how is the caste system kept in place? How do you understand the relationship of caste to political economy? How do you understand women's labor, the relationship of women's labor to subsistence production, and of the centrality of women's labor to a sense of working within a limited environment, that you cannot be exploitative of the environment without exploiting women's labor. So Gail's writing combines many of these themes, and it's fascinating. But much of this was sort of published from the late 70s onwards. Veena Das, who wrote a fair amount about female sexuality and women's roles through the 70s. Kamala Ganesh also, who came to sociology as a feminist and could not look askance and away from caste. Nirmala Banerjee, whose early work on labor actually points to what happened to caste-based female labor in the late colonial period, and equally what happens when women are pushed into the informal market. Who are these women? Typically, from what communities do they hail, and so on. Work that was available by the 1980s. Leela Dubey, sociologist, who wrote a great deal on the different ways in which women encountered matrimony, kinship relations based on the caste that they belonged to. So she sort of displaced the normative understanding of the so-called Hindu family, which usually is largely based on an understanding of the upper caste family. And she brought to the forefront the diverse family forms, kinship patterns, and how might we then work with these diverse ways of being female in the Indian context. Gabriela Dietrich, who came to India in the 70s, fascinating woman and a fascinating life. She was one of the first to visit Kilwenmani from after 1968, apart from those who were active in the left movement. And she did a remarkable study of women's labor, religiosity, and their understanding of justice. The book was sort of published by a small Christian research center, so it was not as widely known as it ought to have been. But she also was one of the earliest to pick on caste as an analytical category. And Prem Chowdhury, whose work on Haryana points to a different set of caste arrangements, which belong to that part of the Indian subcontinent. And Karan Kapadia, who wrote a lot on caste in the South Indian, especially Tamil context from the late 80s onwards. The point is that while all of this has been around for a while, much of this has been around for a while, what makes Uma's essay important is, I think that's an interesting question to ask, because what is it that we can learn from something that becomes an iconic text? How might we excavate its wider context? How might we locate it in its own time? And how might we move away from it to look at other things? So, which is the reason why I wanted to provide this sort of a scholarly excavation, which will allow us to see Uma's text as sort of coming in a context where there was already some amount of writing on caste and gender, and a great deal of protest on the ground to do with issues pertaining to caste, gender, and class. So that's something. Now, the other context that we need to keep in mind is the emergence of the women's movements of the 1970s. And here it's quite interesting that, and which is, of course, in today's context, extremely ironic if you realize where Madhu Kishwar's politics has located her today. But in the late 70s and early 80s, if you look at Manushi, these were some of the themes that you find that the magazine regularly reports on. Landless labor, Adivasi women, within quotes, Harijan women, on Bhakti, on Buddhism. There are essays by Dalit activists from Tamil Nadu. So this is also interesting that a lot of empirical descriptive writing was available. And Gale was writing about women's struggles, not necessarily in Manushi, but in other places, social scientists, for example, on Ambedkarite women who were organizing in the 80s. So you have an incipient women's movement from the 70s onwards, and a very strongly emergent movement by the 80s, where the caste question was being posed and spoken about from different points of view. It was not central to how feminism was conceptualized or the social order was understood, but neither was it entirely absent from debates that belong to that period in time. And if you look at the early two histories of the women's movement, Issues at Stake by Nandita Shah and Nandita Gandhi, or A Space Within the Struggle edited by Elena Sen, you will see how they struggle with caste. Because clearly it is the big elephant in the room and no one knows quite how to name it. It's not that it's unnameable, we're all familiar with it, but how does one bring that into feminist focus? One can endlessly describe atrocities, violence, one can account for different experiences of violence or different levels of subordination. But how might we place ourselves as feminists in a reflexive and critical sense within what we are trying to comprehend? So while all of this is in the air, you also see, for various reasons, that there's an efflorescence of writing about anti-caste movements in the 1980s and 1990s. And some of us in Tamil Nadu, S. Anandi, for instance, and then subsequently me and many others, were researching the Tamil anti-caste movements. And suddenly there was this sort of literature that was emerging, which called into questions many of the verities of what constitutes the subject of feminism. Is it the woman is it women with a capital W who is constantly in this position of sexual vulnerability, and the violence done to that woman ought to constitute the fulcrum of feminist politics? Or is it that this woman that we imagine to be the feminist subject is herself a fragmented subject, and that she is fragmented constitutively by caste at one level? She's also complicit with what she seeks to challenge. So I think these are issues that emerge from the 1990s. And so Uma's text comes exactly at that moment, with this history of the women's movement, which is behind her, of which she is a part, and the kind of work done in women's studies scholarship, the new scholarship that's emergent on the ground, and Anandi, myself, Sharmila Rege in the 90s, and Uma's own politics. Because I think what's interesting about Uma Chakravarti is she's never been entirely subsumed within the terms of debate that were defined within women's studies or within the women's movements, because she also was located within the civil rights movement. She was a long-time member of the PUDR. And as part of that, she was also very familiar with the differentiated discrimination, subordination, and violence that was visited on minorities, for example. The PUDR put out a very important report on the 1984 riots against the Sikhs in Delhi. She was also part of a team that visited the Northeast to inquire into the disturbances and violence against women in the late 80s, especially the horror inflicted in the region by the Assam Rifles. And she's written a very important essay in that context where she speaks of how difficult it was to convince certain feminists who were part of her team that one cannot really have a feminism that does not critique the Indian state's patriarchal and majoritarian attitude towards the Northeast. So, and I think that also sort of made it inevitable that she would be far more sensitive to the caste question than some of her peers. And besides, she was a scholar of Buddhism. Her early writings were all on Buddhism. So one needs to situate conceptualizing a Brahmanical patriarchy in the context of various histories of the women's movement, of civil rights movements, of writing on caste and gender from various disciplines, of struggles by Dalits and Adivasis and other subaltern women during the entire period from the 60s onwards. So when we think of the insight that conceptualizing Brahmanical patriarchy provides us, that's an insight that had a certain strength because it sort of emerged out of the intersection of these many things. But equally, it emerged at a very opportune historical moment, the Mandal Masjid moment. And as Uma would later on remark in her book, Gendering Caste, all of us were confronted with this we were shocked by this phenomenon of upper caste women who would say that if reservations were put in place, who would be married? Some of you might remember that there was this whole thing of upper caste men polishing shoes on the streets of Delhi and Hyderabad, and the women going out and saying that reservation becomes a truism, who would be married, basically saying that reservation challenges our right to making an endogamous marriage. Endogamy being sort of, expanded to include people from the same caste cluster, not simply the immediate caste around. So that was pretty shocking. And I think Uma this essay is also shadowed by that experience that many of us were witness to in 89, 90, and through the 90s, in fact. So I think the whole caste and gender question has acquired the kind of resonance that it did. Also, very importantly, because of the continuous assertion of subaltern caste and Dalit communities since the 60s in one form or the other, women's assertion from within various contexts, and writing on caste and gender from within the women's studies and other related disciplines. Now, what I want to do is to take an about turn at this point, because I think what's important about Uma's essay is that she put caste and gender firmly on the feminist agenda for our times. But of course, that does not mean that the arguments that she foregrounds in that essay have not been discussed or talked about earlier. And I think the one person that did speak about it at length is Baba Saheb Dr. Ambedkar. And I think we need to revisit some of those essays where he points out how the caste order is held in place by endogamy, which is something most anthropologists will tell you is a commonsensical notion. But I think Ambedkar takes that argument far beyond being just a mechanism, as he calls it, in caste in India. In caste in India, he calls it a mechanism. What is the mechanism that keeps the caste order in place? He says it's caste endogamy. He sort of reviews other writings on caste and finally comes to this point of understanding that it is endogamy that keeps the caste order in place. But interestingly, Ambedkar also uses a very interesting word, enclosure. Now, students of political economy know that the enclosure is what inaugurates the moment of industrial capitalism in the West. And Ambedkar was quite familiar with that literature, the emergence of capitalism in the West. So he alerts us to the possibility of thinking about enclosures emerging not only in the sphere of production, but also in the sphere of reproduction. So if you were to understand caste, you have to understand it in the context of what it forbids and what it allows. And endogamy is a mechanism through which varnas in ancient India sought to constitute themselves into an enclosed class. And that's a term from caste in India, where Ambedkar calls, class becomes enclosed caste through the mechanism of endogamy. So, and I think the word enclosed is not used in a light-hearted manner. He continues to use that word several times later on in his writings. So what we have from Ambedkar, whether the details of his argument are historically accurate or not is a different matter. Whether sati and ritual widowhood and asceticism of men were means to manage, to keep a parity among the two sexes. Now, whether that's how it happened is not as important as the fact that he proposes a theory of sexual enclosure, which he sees as central to the sustaining of the caste order. And that sexual enclosure becomes a form of social enclosure through what he calls the logic of imitation. So the Brahmins first enclose themselves into a caste group and the others imitate them. And that's an argument he makes in 1916. But most of us stop with that essay. But we need to go beyond it and see how he pulls that argument in other directions in subsequent writing as well. So if you take the chapter Triumph of Brahmanism in Revolution and Counter-Revolution in ancient India, Ambedkar is not so much interested in the fact whether this came about because of imitation, which would be not very different from, say, the Sanskritization argument. But that's not what he means, either in caste in India or subsequently. But he sees imitation as less important, but what he gives premium to, he now chooses to highlight the historical moment at which this could have happened. And that historical moment is what he calls the triumph of Brahmanism. And to him, that happened in consequence of the challenges posed to an emergent Varna hierarchy by Buddha and the Buddhists. And it is the world historical conquest of Buddhism by Brahmanism that institutes Brahmanical Hinduism and the logic that we have at present, which he then goes on to describe in some extremely important conceptual ways, the logic being the logic of graded inequality. So he talks of how there's inequality in every society, but no society is premised on this idea of graded inequality, where each social segment is arranged in a kind of a triangular formulation, either above or below another social segment. So as you go up the triangle, your respect increases. As you come down, you face humiliation and contempt. And imagine in this, to keep this in place, sexuality has to be regulated. And therefore, sexuality also has to be graded. So who is the most pure? The one at the top. And who is the most violable is the one at the bottom. And who is even beyond the logic of violability and inviolabilities are those who are placed outside this segment, which are basically the Dalits and Adivasis. So the logic of purity and promiscuity do not even apply to these communities, all of whom are considered both sexually, socially, and in terms of labor, entirely available for exploitation by the twice-born castes, or by all Savarnas. And for Ambedkar, Shudras also were part of the Savarna group of communities because they were within the social order. So the graded inequality captures all of this. And then I think the most important theoretical argument that Ambedkar makes is the sustaining of endogamy. The sustaining of endogamy is nothing but the sustaining of graded inequality and untouchability. But the sustaining of these two is rendered possible through ideological means. And quoting Hegel, he says, this is effected through Hindu scripture, which idealizes the real. Basically, he calls attention to how the Purusha Sukta describes the way four communities are created. And he says, basically, the Purusha Sukta emerged at a time when this system was sort of getting to be socially put in place. So it is describing the real, but it is describing it in such a way that it idealizes the real. So which means, and it realizes the ideal simultaneously. So the ideal and the real are confounded in some complicated ways. And for Ambedkar, this is very important because any break in the system, and there are breaks, people challenge the system at different points in time, all of these are immediately folded back into the system. So that whatever happens, if there is a clash with a new community, then that community, parts of it are absorbed within the caste order. And those that refuse to be absorbed are placed outside of it. So the logic continues to sustain itself in different ways. And Ambedkar, like D.D. Kosambi, sees caste as the very antithesis of history. The caste confounds history. Caste tries to dehistoricize our lives by making it seem that this is how things are, this is how things have always been, this is how things should be. And so the logic of social reproduction, which is the endogamous logic, is something that has acquired weight and resonance both through sexual as well as ideological reproduction. And you cannot imagine the one without the other. And that's Ambedkar's point of view. And the subjugation of women is central to this project, and which is why he was so emphatic about the Hindu Code Bill, not because he thought it was a revolutionary piece of legislation. In fact, he says we're doing the bare minimum, but to him it was important because it challenged customary and other laws. As he says in one of the replies that he provides to those who say that the bill hasn't gone far enough, until now we have relied on the smritis and the shrutis, but for now we are making our own laws, and that is the importance of the Hindu Code Bill. Because he felt that if human-made law is not like the law of the shrutis and the smritis, because that logic of graded inequality is sanctified and kept alive through an ideological process, which makes inequality itself sacred, right? So, and I think that's something that he saw ought to be countered by secular legal means, however limited they are, hence the importance attached to the Hindu Code Bill. And I think if you go from Uma Chakravarti back to Ambedkar, what you actually then see, for those of us who are interested in a feminism that engages with caste in a sustained and critical manner, is that to challenge endogamy, to challenge the kind of compulsory heterosexuality and the compulsory procreative imperative that is imposed on women, one needs to necessarily also challenge graded inequality and untouchability. You can't do this thing by halves, because all of these come together in a very integrated fashion. And that's something that Ambedkar makes very clear. And I want to now sort of come back to the present and ask us, and so that we can ask ourselves, how might we enrich our understanding of what Ambedkar set out to do? How might feminist scholarship contribute to our understanding in a sense? So I had provided a list of readings to Saujanya and her students, and I just want to go through the list of readings in a manner that would help us plot some things in a productive kind of manner. This is not the only way you can plot them. You can plot them in other ways as well. There are other texts also that you can bring to the table, but I have just chosen to bring a set of texts that are perhaps not as well known as some other. Say Uma Chakravarti's texts are better known than some others. Sharmila Rege's work is sort of well known. And today you have a generation of young Dalit feminists who are beginning to write and who are also very active and visible. So I'm not looking at those texts, but I'm looking at a set of disparate essays, all of which might help us to understand and take on board the gravity of what Dr. Ambedkar has called attention to, that the Hindu social order, if it has to be challenged, has to be challenged at the level of endogamy, that you challenge the regulation of sexuality, the sexual enclosures in which we find ourselves, hence the Hindu Code Bill, which grants unfettered right to divorce, though it does not remain unfettered for too long, and remarriage and all of that. But also that to challenge this endogamy also necessarily should lead you to challenge graded inequality. So one needs to understand what is this graded inequality in terms of several aspects of our social existence. And I think some of this scholarship helps us to do that. So Kumkum Roy's essay, which is on ancient India, again, she's, as some of you might know, she's a professor of ancient history, retired from JNU, and her written a lot on ancient India, and I find her work on the Kama Sutra particularly fascinating because she actually talks about the Dvija self, right? The connoisseur of women and sex who's central to the Kama Sutra. Who is this person? And what is his sense of self? And I think the manner in which that self is constructed also is a very important aspect of how you understand graded inequality. Because sexual acts are also graded, as you will see if you read the Kama Sutra. And while it sort of admits of the possibility of lesbianism or of same-sex love, these are not to be confused with the necessary heteronormative sexual act that will alone lead to proper, appropriate procreation. So while there is a kind of an accommodation of sexual of orientations of different kinds, those are viewed in largely instrumental terms. And Kumkum's work actually calls attention to that. But the essay that I had actually put in this pack is very interesting because it offers a gloss on what Ambedkar argues in The Triumph of Brahmanism, where he points to the emergence of endogamy, the emergence of the practice of investing the sacred thread, that Dvijas claim for themselves, Brahmins especially. He suggests that all of them emerged simultaneously in historical time. So the separation of Brahmins from all the rest and the separation of sexual commons into so many different enclosures, all of these happen at the same time. So the institution of inequality is at once sex, gender, and I think Kumkum's essay helps us understand that in a very nuanced historical sort of way and helps us expand what Ambedkar argues in The Triumph of Brahmanism. And if you read that along with her work on the Kama Sutra, you also get a sense of how do you think of the social being of the oppressor, of the one that has put the system in place. Who is this person? What is his sense of himself? And how may we relate his sense of sexual and social entitlement to the way the social order is structured? So the entitlement that the Brahmin grants himself and the rest of his caste, and the entitlements that are allowed to upper caste women, provided they keep within the caste scheme of things, how are these related to the larger social order? In other words, how do you understand the complicity of upper caste women and the price that they pay for this complicity and the rewards that they earn in the process? And what do they have to lose if they were to step out of this? And so I think some of these essays help us understand that in a very nuanced kind of way by describing the larger social order and what's expected of men and women from the upper caste to maintain that social order. So, and I think rarely do we think of what the upper classes do when they rule, and these texts help us unpack what do they do when they rule? What does it mean to rule, to dominate? And so Kumkum's essay does that in a very interesting way. And Pankaj Jha's essay, this belongs to a very interesting set of essays that were published under a title called Servants' Pasts. So it's basically, they started off as enquiries into domestic servitude, but historically domestic servitude has existed along many axes. And Pankaj Jha's essays reviews a set of Sanskrit texts which refer to the widespread servitude of Shudras. And he raises some very important questions about servitude itself. Is it premised on the fact that the Dharma Shastras allow you to morally retain your sense of integrity while practicing enslavement? You can be a moral person while practicing slavery because that is ordained by the scriptures. The Shudra is there to serve you. And of course, the Shudra's terms of service are not set only by what he or she actually gets to do in any context, but also what he or she is expected to do in a normative sense. So, and I think that the way in which Varna norms are invoked and then linked to secular norms, and I think that's very, very important and helps us understand what Ambedkar meant when he says idealizing the real and realizing the ideal. Constantly Varna norms sort of hover over secular norms, so that even if you were to have the IPC could be interpreted in a way that reproduces the logic of Varna-based understanding of what each of us deserves. So each time a policeman indulges in expletives against a Dalit or against a woman, you know where that's coming from. While he might invoke particular provisions in a secular IPC, his reasoning is drawn from Varna norms. So I think this whole sort of adjacency of Varna norms along with so-called secular norms of securing either servitude or even for that matter, equality, it's a very complicated question. And Pankaj Jha's essay helps us understand what Ambedkar actually means by graded inequality. It's not simply a structural thing. It's also a social thing to do with consciousness, how we think of ourselves in relationship to other people. And for Ambedkar, that was very important. He was a student of social psychology as well. And he was constantly thinking of what do we do when we treat someone with contempt or in a spirit of discrimination? What are we doing? And what does it do to ourselves? What does it do to others? So I think to understand some of these things in a historical sense, that this is taken as a way of being historically, Pankaj Jha's essay points out how that is done and how that might be understood. Because I think if we as feminists want to think of social reproduction, we may also have to think of these matters, that this is kept in place through a Varna system of right and wrong. And how might we as feminists think about that? Much as we are all invested in secular politics, we need to also be able to engage with the worlds of Varna. And how do we do that? And that is something that only the literature of anti-caste movements has done, or anti-caste activism has done. Whether it's feminism or socialism, we have not sufficiently worked within the protocols that have been put in place by anti-caste movements. And I think Pankaj Jha's essay points to how one can think of slavery, caste, varna, gender in complex ways. And the last in this section is Charu Gupta's essay. Can I take another 15 minutes, Saujanya? Yeah. So Charu Gupta's essay is quite fascinating, especially in view of where we are today in the present, in the political present. But I'm not going to make a point about the political present. But what she points to is from the late 1880s in the Hindi public sphere, remember how we started out by saying that endogamy is a kind of a sexual enclosure, and the Brahmins enclosed themselves and others followed them. And Ambedkar then says how they followed them is one thing, but basically this happened because Buddhism had challenged Brahmanism, and then it in turn challenged Buddhism in very violent terms, both discursively and politically. And so you have this logic of graded inequality and untouchability being put in place. That's Ambedkar's argument. Now, one of the things that's very central to this is, as I've just pointed out, is you have to convince people that some of us are born bad and some of us are born good. Birth-based inequality is something you have to convince everybody about. And how do you do that? And what is the social psychology that secures it? And Charu Gupta's essays points out how that was done at a particular point in time, which is the early 20th century. And how are Dalits othered? How are Dalit bodies positioned in caste Hindu discourse? And she looks at it in several ways. But basically what she wants us to notice is that the anxiety over Dalits, why does it become a source of discomfort for the upper caste in the early 20th century? Is it because Dalits are protesting? Is it because of conversion? Is it because of social reform inspired by the Arya Samaj and various others? Why is the caste Hindu self so anxious about othering Dalits, about saying things about Dalits, especially Dalit women? And the kinds of ways in which Dalit women are othered, And here as feminists, we need to think of something that we read in all our basic history classes in various women's studies courses about the social reform project of the 19th century. As we all know, the subject of that social reform was the upper caste Hindu woman, whether as a widow or as a child bride or one forced to commit sati, she had to be rescued. And she had to be made an appropriate helpmeet of the reforming upper caste male. So she was to be educated up to a certain limit, but not beyond that. She was to follow certain feminine professions, but not aspire to step out of the caste family. So there was all this stuff going on around social reform. And one of the ways in which that appears to have been done from the literature that Charu Gupta provides us is by securing the upper caste women's consent to a limited social reform project. Look, we'll send you to college, but don't start asking questions about the caste family. And how is that to be done? By insistently differentiating the upper caste woman's subjectivity from the subjectivity of lower caste women. So if you do anything that is not expected of you as an upper caste woman, then you are like those other bad women. And so Dalit female bodies and cells are construed in such a manner, they become the other of the proper Hindu woman, the woman that you should never be, you know. And in popular culture, that becomes this whole pati patni or wo type of thing. But the wo is a very caste specific being in this context. Either the lower caste women or more specifically the Dalit. And this gets exacerbated when Dalits convert, because they have now access to a different language of self-worth. So then you have the media demonizing the converts and demonizing the Dalit female convert especially. So Charugupta points to all this out in a very, very interesting way. And I think this really pushes us to examine as feminists how our own selfhoods, depending on which caste we belong to and where we are situated in the hierarchy, is so implicated in this project of our own liberation. So either we rethink the terms of liberation as constantly expanding and universal, and that I cannot imagine my liberation without the concomitant liberation of Dalit women, or I settle for something where I insist on my rights, my entitlements, all the time aware that I'm doing this by othering various others who have equally the same rights as I have. And that's a challenge that we face today in a very different kind of a context. But I think what Charugupta's essays points out is how this endogamous sexual enclosure demands us to be, as feminists, to be critical of heteronormative caste families and our own role in taking these as normative or taking these for granted. And I think that's an important thing. The second thing is, interestingly enough, the sexual economy of the caste system also bisects with the political economy of caste. And basically, the way in which sexual identity itself is degraded depending on where you are. So Dalit women and other women are even beyond the logic of violable and inviolable. Shudra women are placed within the violable logic, but they can still be violated with impunity. Brahmin women are considered inviolable and pure. So there is this differentiated logic of violability and inviolability. And some of it also has to do with the fact that the labor of the subaltern women are needed for the upkeep of the caste order. And that labor is continuously stigmatized, whether it is the labor of care within the household. In order to naturalize women's labor within the household, women are seen as women only if they do that work, so that they don't question that, and then they remain sort of completely trapped by the glories of motherhood and wifehood. But if you're without the caste order and you're laboring to keep the caste order's economics in place as workers, as different service providers, as we call them today, as dobbies, as those that help with childbirth, as sanitary workers, or as women who labor in the informal sector as a whole today to keep all our households overflowing with the goods that we need. And these are invariably from Dalit Bahujan communities. So the question of labor and the question of the devaluing of women's labor become very important for us to understand. While feminists across the world have talked a lot about the devaluing of women's household labor, of how the reproduction of life within the household is never granted prominence, and how women's subsistence labor is never granted value. In the Indian context, it seems important to talk about the devaluation of the wide variety of care labor that Dalits and other subaltern communities undertake, particularly Dalit and other subaltern women undertake. So the two essays here point to how we might think of that. Meena Gopal's essay in particular about caste labor and stigma, where she looks at the work of midwives, of bar dancers, and a whole host of other workers who are seen as both sexually and economically valueless and exploitable. And how might one think of that? And Samita Sen, who looks at how women who go out to work, whether in the fields or in industry or in plantations, are seen as beings who can be sent out to labor, provided their families view it as valuable or not valuable based on their own understanding of caste. So is it okay to send my daughter and wife out to work in a jute industry? Now, the interesting thing that Samita Sen also points out is that women are so trapped within such limited conditions of existence. If you're a widow, if you find yourself without a male patron, if you are alone, you don't want to live within the caste community because it means nothing but wretchedness. So many of them choose to flee and go and work in these newly emergent workspaces in the 20th century. And then what can they expect there? And how might their lives unfold there? So it is very hard to separate the question of female labor and caste stigma for a wide section of our population. And therefore, to attend to the question of labor becomes very important. How might we think of social reproduction and labor reproduction through endogamy, therefore? So you're not just reproducing the social order, you're also reproducing the conditions in which a majority of women will continue to labor. So that's also something that we need to add on to the reproduction of endogamy, the reproduction of the discourses that that valorize endogamy and graded inequality, and also the actual production of laborers, especially a large segment of laborers who perform what we consider valueless or stigmatized labor. And that brings me to the last part of my thing, Shailaja Paik's essay, one of our leading Dalit feminist scholars of today, who's written this fantastic book called The Vulgarity of Caste, which is about tamasha women in tamasha in Maharashtra, but also how might one think of the sexual labor of women, such as the women in tamasha and so on. But basically what Shailaja Paik does is she returns us to Ambedkar's project of liberation from caste. And she says that the liberation from caste for Baba Saheb from the 30s was a liberation from Hinduism itself. But how might we think of that project if those who are stigmatized are also seen as objects only of reform? And she picks on Ambedkar's famous Kamatipura speech. And she says, while one can entirely understand this call to manuski or to self-respect, how might we understand women positioned within the sex industry, whether as performers or as sex workers? And what can their understanding of manuski be? Is it to be on the same terms as what the reformers wanted, even if the reformers are Dalit reformers? Might it not be as important to listen to what the women have to say? Because in this project towards Dharmantar, these women might want to be part of Dharmantar on their own terms as well. And what can that possibly mean? And for her, it's very important because she sees the performing Dalit woman as Ambedkar views the Brahmin woman. Because when he talks of caste in India, when he talks of sexual parity, the control of Brahmin women, which is achieved through sati, ritual widowhood, and through child marriage, whereas sexuality is regulated in certain ways, and therefore there's no possibility of there being a surplus Brahmin woman, right? So every Brahmin man will somehow find his wife, and the surplus Brahmin woman is either killed off, or she'll remain a widow, or she'll be married off as a child. Shailaja says, but what about the surplus women in other communities? What happens to them? And she picks on the example of performing Dalit artists as surplus women who connote sexual excess beyond what is allowed by the caste order. So they are not women who can be respectable wives. They're outside the heteronormative framework. They're beings in their own right, but they're constantly devalued and treated as sexually available and violable. So how might one understand their predicament? Ambedkar, of course, wants a wholesale transformation of their selves. He wants them to leave behind that world and move into Dharmantar along with the rest of the Dalit fraternity. But the question that Paik raises is, how might we then listen with respect to what the women have to say about their liberation? They may not be resistant to Dharmantar, but neither might they want to be seen as bearers of stigma and bearers of stigma alone. They might want to be seen as fulsome human persons in their own right. So how might we then do that? And she cautions us that neither this thing of celebrating women's sexuality as has happened in some feminist contexts when we celebrate the sexual agency of non-conjugal women in performance, women in prostitution, where we speak of their agency in fulsome terms. She feels that that does not capture the structural nature of what Dalit women endure as tamasha performers, but neither can one therefore only seek to reform them within a project of a generalized manuski. So how might we then think about this? How might we work with it as a challenge for the Dalit movement, for the women's movement? And her work is very nuanced, and especially her book, The Vulgarity of Caste, is positioned within all these discourses. So I want to end on that note, basically sort of want to end by pointing out that if we think of social reproduction, starting with Vima's seminal essay, we need to also think of all that makes such writing possible at any given point in time, and the struggles and the scholarship before, and how that cannot be seen as only one text that's sort of a node, but how that node has led to other things as well. And it ought to be connected with other nodes as well. And once we do that, we can think of social reproduction across disciplines, labor history, for instance, performance studies for another, anthropology for a third, and how might we draw from all these insights? I think once we do that, then the whole project of social reproduction starts from endogamy, takes on board graded inequality and untouchability, takes on board the study of ideologies, especially from Shastric texts that justify it and which are renewed from time to time in 100 different ways. And also how we might challenge all of this also from within the materiality of everyday life, from the fact that many Dalit Bahujan women are laborers, belong to the laboring class, and how might then we work with all of this. There's a lot of fruitful room for discussion and thinking of these matters, and I've just tried to create a map for us to think together with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. So shall I ask the students to ask you questions now? Now
Yeah,
it's open for
sure. That's
discussion and
Yeah,
responses and questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
questions being put on chat or?
If it is on chat, I will
know.
read it out to you.
Yeah,
If they
okay.
want to ask, they can just raise their hands,
Okay.
and
Okay.
that is also fine. Yeah.
I'll also keep chat open, so it's easier.
Yeah. That's better. So in case there are no questions, okay, Samyukta.
Yes, ma'am. So
Yeah.
I have a question with regard to the current debate that is surrounding the UCC. So we've seen that UCC is supposed to grant women the right to equality and protection of law and prevent the violation that happens with regard to the personal laws. So in this context of protection for women, and the caste inequality that is rampant across, irrespective of all religions, we see that caste inequality exists. So where do we, what kind of implications will the Dalit women face that with regard to triple, they're already facing the question of triple oppression. So what are the social implications of this UCC on Dalit women? What are the possible implications? I would like to know.
It's as yet very unclear what the government actually means by UCC. It's kept it deliberately vague. We are not sure what they mean. As you know, it is part of the directive principles of the Constitution that we shall push towards a uniform civil code. Ambedkar himself was not averse to a uniform code because I think for him, tidying up the various facets of Hindu law was a task that he had set himself. So I think what perhaps is lost in this discussion is that the tidying up of Hindu law hasn't been fully finished at all. Hindu law still is problematic in many ways. There have been amendments. There have also been areas of criminal law which really have to do with Hindu law, but not only in the sense of it having to do with marriage and inheritance and guardianship and so on, but something like, say, the Atrocities Act, which is also about acts committed on persons. It's not only criminal in terms of it goes against the spirit of certain existing penal laws, but also that it enjoys social sanction and social impunity. So in that sense, perhaps for Dalit women, the question that might be very fruitful to foreground is that how might we even understand a demand for a UCC when the codification of Hindu law itself is highly incomplete, problematic. There are many aspects that needs to be thought through and thought about. And how might we even come to this question in any meaningful way when that's not very clear at one level? And secondly, I think while it is explicitly directed at the minorities, particularly Muslims, one of the things that from within the women's movement that there's a long history of engaging with the whole question of the civil code also, uniform civil code from the 80s onwards. And several options have been put forth and as to how might we think about this. And many women's groups have favored the term gender just civil code rather than a uniform civil code. They've also pointed to the need to rethink custom and rethink law practices from within. And people like Flavia Agnes have said this within is not simply the within of Muslim communities, but equally of Hindu communities. You also have to ask yourself where you stand with respect to many practices. So it's not as if the Hindu situation is great and therefore we can go ahead and use that as normative and do a UCC. So that's been one way in which feminists have responded. There's also been another set of responses which challenge the heteronormative sort of logic that is behind all of this. And as you know, right now, the whole question of same-sex marriages is also being heard in the Supreme Court. So I think there are many ways in which one can come to a critique of the UCC. But I think from the context of what we've been discussing, a very important axis along which we think about this is, what is this thing about being Hindu and being subject to a system of laws? What has been gained, what has been lost, what has not been tapped upon, and how have these answered to the realities of Dalit Bahujan existence? And I think those are questions that we might need to foreground and talk about. I hope that clarified something.
Yes.
Yeah, ma'am, do you mind closing the sharing of your screen?
Yeah, I will.
Yeah. So next question, someone called Sai Thakur wants to talk.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Thank you for that really wonderful talk. I have this question. I don't know whether it's really a question, but when it comes to this whole discussion about caste, gender, and when you also bring in labor, social reproduction, I always wonder about what happens to the Bahujan women, because usually, it's about Dalit women. Sometimes Dalit Bahujan women is used, and they are perhaps tagged along. But I feel sometimes that they are invisibilized. They don't have their own separate identity, because I think the Bahujan women have a sort of a different reality than Dalit women. So sometimes they are grouped under Savarna and they became the exploiters, and on the other times they are just invisible. So yeah, that was my comment, question.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. That's a very useful thing to think about. Perhaps rather than think about the separateness of women, or to think of it in terms of the connectedness of women, one might want to think about their historical and social positioning. And I think in terms of labor, for example, Bahujan women are known to and continue to work alongside Dalit women in any number of professions. Socially, that distance does not get always bridged. There is that's at one level. And in terms of organizing women as labor, whether it is the work done by Seva in the 18s and 19s in Gujarat, or the work of trade unions in different parts of the country, you see that the word labor is used to bring together women from different social locations, whether it's in the garment workers industry, say, for example. It is only when we come to very particular industries like sanitary workers that the identity of the worker becomes very specific and very defined in some ways. So this is a reality within which labor, caste, and gender come together or not come together, depending on where one is and what one is doing at the moment. Now, the identity of the Bahujan woman, how might one talk about it? In terms of the social cultural logic of the Hindu social order, Ambedkar would want us to see her as part of the Varna system, and the Dalit woman as somebody who's placed outside the Varna system. Now, in terms of everyday life, of social reproduction and labor, for example, she is likely to share more with the Dalit woman rather than the other Dvija women with whom she is grouped. So, for example, if you read Asha Singh's essay, she's written this very interesting essay on the work done by Ahir women, by women who look after from the Ahir community in Bihar, where the labor of women and the work that they do is foregrounded in the maintenance of cattle and animals and so on. She wrote this essay in the context of the beef ban. And all that is at stake for women who work with animals and whose labor that is. They are subsistence workers, they are people that help to keep life alive, to keep farms going and so on. And how do you see their labor in terms of the current discourse around the banning or consumption of beef? And how this question also has to be seen adjacent to the beef question in some ways, but it's not entirely a cultural question. It also has to do with economics and female labor, and how might we then begin to understand that. So that's one way in which we can complicate the question of identity and culture, because it's simply not one of exclusion and inclusion. You don't eat this, I will eat this, or you have to eat only this and I won't eat this. But it's also that there's a labor that has made that eating possible, and how might we then talk about that labor in relation to what is produced, but also in relation to what separates the laborer from everybody else with whom she's grouped. So what does she have in common with either the Kayas or the Kshatriyas or the Rajputs? She has much more in common with those who work on the fields, but who are placed outside the caste order. But that relationship cannot also be seamless, because caste does separate. So it's a complicated question. I don't think I have any clear answers, but I do think to think about the work of women that are termed Shudra, which itself is a very inchoate set of communities, a very amorphous set of communities. How might we think of their position as something that needs to be perhaps posed in a very specific kind of way, given where we work or where we are. But on the other hand, the logic of social reproduction, they are also implicated. Take a state like Tamil Nadu. For example, much of the violence that we have seen in recent times, where daughters and sons-in-law are killed, have also been at the instigation of women from these Bahujan communities. So an investment in the social logic of reproduction and being part of the economics of production, these two things unfold along different axes. So just being part of the laboring economy doesn't always sort of immunize you from the kind of social prejudices that are part of your milieu. And those social prejudices can prove deeply consequential. So it's, and therefore I think for feminists, the challenge is to articulate a generalized challenge to patriarchy in terms of sexual control and social control, but also a more nuanced understanding of how one might have to heed the voices of what, Dale Ombed was many years ago called the most downgraded of the downgraded. So I think it is in that conversation that where do you remain silent, where do you insist on fraternity, where do you sort of agree to terms of, politics, which are not immediately pertinent to your situation, but with which you have to work with. I think those are the ways in which I would think about this.
Okay, so Mohana wants to ask a question. Mohana, unmute yourself.
Hello, ma'am. Yeah, good evening. Hello, ma'am. Good evening. I'm audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. And thank you for your lovely presentation of the varied literature on the subject. I was
Can
just
you speak
wondering.
a bit? Your voice is sort of
coming very intermittently. So either you need to check with your internet. Or...
Yeah.
Internet. Okay. Is it better now? I hope it's better.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah.
We'll see.
So I was wondering. We spoke about social enclosures, right? And we spoke about how. I'm thinking about how the labor force participation of women also tend to kind of replay these kind of enclosed systems only. For instance, the pink economy, or say the care economy, being largely replicative of the existing caste, gender, reproductive practices in the personal private sphere, right? So I was wondering, what would your take be on it? Even the most advanced labor market participative systems right now keep reflecting these biased reproductive patterns in terms of who participates in what, or which category of women participate in what part of the economy. Right? So I was just wondering what might be your perspectives to it.
No, the thing is, the history of modern industrialization in India has unfolded within the logic of the caste order. So if you take even men in industry, take traditional industry, for example, like say textile mills, If you read Chandavarkar's work on the history of Bombay's textile mills, you'll see how much of the labor that was in demand in Bombay was segmented along caste lines. So if you left your village and you were a Maratha Kundi, you would make for the weaver's shed in the textile industry. If you were a Dalit, you would be a head loader, or you would work on the railway. Or if you were from unspecified lower caste communities, as happened in Kolkata, you could all be en masse into a new community of sanitary workers. When Tanika Sarkar has pointed out how a category of sanitary worker emerged in the early 20th century, composed of people from several so-called downgraded communities. So I think caste has been a pathway along which the labor market was segmented in this country from the earliest days of modernization. And while there has been some pushing against it in terms of some gains that have been made on account of reservation, because of migration and so on, the overall logic sort of continues to be in place. But I do think also that the disruption of that logic has happened more than a disruption of the social logic in some ways. Because I think there has been a way in which people from subaltern communities have found their way into certain economic enclaves more than they have been able to into social or intellectual enclaves. Those have been a greater challenge. But this is not to say, therefore, that caste has ceased to matter. But this ought not to surprise us, right? Because if caste is also a system of production, and that's what we're also saying, it's both a system of production and reproduction. But because whatever caste you are born into, you receive the tools of that caste. And if you want to be something else, you've got to fight for it. So if I'm born into a Barber community, I can expect at best to own a salon in a city. But if I want to become a musician or a scientist, I have to fight. I have to insist on my rights of reservation. I have to be part of political movements to get wherever I'm going. So in that sense, I think caste is a production relationship, but caste is also a social reproduction relationship in that it is held in place in the household. So I think if you're talking about the pink economy and about that space being largely occupied by people from the upper caste, by women from the upper caste, for example, it is also the case that those women will continue to occupy those spaces unless there's a density of them challenging their familial and caste privilege and sort of admitting that there should be a wider logic of reservation in private industry, which I don't see any of these women wanting to do. So I think unless you're part of those struggles for reservation and for social justice, this logic will continue to be in place.
Yeah, I have a question.
Thank you, ma'am.
Mohana, if that is fine with you. Like you're done, then I have a question. So
I just wanted a little follow-up on.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Is that all right?
Yeah, sure. Tell me.
Is that all right if I have a follow-up, please?
Yeah.
Yeah, ma'am. So I was wondering, so I'm a student of development studies. So from a policy perspective, then I understand we're talking about it from a society perspective and what should be done. From a policy perspective, then what might be your proposition to, work towards this breakdown of the social reproductive logic that finds itself being replicated everywhere?
See, I mean, it is something that no private industry wants to hear, reservation. I mean, that is a time-honored perspective which has opened up access in the public sector. And secondly, also at the point of access to higher education. How does one then democratize higher education in an era of increasing privatization? A very highly acclaimed private university asked me, what could we do to make our classrooms more diverse? But they were not willing to listen to any of these answers, whether it's reservation or to democratize education in terms of allowing wider access to lower income groups. All of these would democratize education, but we don't have any quick fixes. Reservation itself is a limited endeavor, but it's an endeavor that has shown results. So one needs to sort of keep at it and insist that it should be made mandatory in private industry as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. So my question is, firstly, thank you so much for agreeing to speak at TISS. And I was very fascinated by two of the facts that, you mentioned. One is that if the reproduction is resolved, there is also social attitudes. And another thing is that this constitutive other, the construction of constitutive other as the Dalit woman for the dominant caste woman. So that is one thing, the new thing that, I looked at in your talk. But my question is actually, as we all know, that you also very, fascinatingly put it in, women are complicit in their choices, right? So in the West, particularly if we see, in America, many scholars like, say, Antoinette Fox or Benjamin Barber, or even, Patricia Hill Collins, looks at this sexism. Sexism is fascinating also because it is racist sexism. On top of it, also, it is placed within this very fascinating, very interesting, beneficial, capitalism of America, right? So do you think that such factors also are there in the choices that are made by dominant caste middle classes in India, women in India, with regard to the reproduction and marriage, where it's not just the Brahminical patriarchy, but, see, Andhra society, for instance, like, highest number of brides that are transported to NRIs, right? So these are also certain, very secular terms, and you don't have to call it as caste, which is pre-modern and which is humiliating, or it has some derogatory thing, okay, associated with it. Whereas here it's like, one can say compatibility with regard to, say, what we eat too, and class compatibility and the class endogamy. So it's kind of covering up and all. I mean, I would like to ask you if there are any researchers on, now we also are under the influence of that neoliberalism and the global capitalism. What happened to the Brahminical patriarchy in these two contexts?
Yes, that's a very important question. There's been very little sustained work on this, on the subject. Chris Fuller did some work on Brahmins in the present and their presence in high-tech industry and so on. And there was some, there was an add-on gender component to that study, but nothing was seriously, it hasn't really been taken forward. But I think what would be interesting is to perhaps ask some questions which would help us unravel this present moment. Because I think what has happened is, if we were to look at the Nehruvian state and the kind of economic growth and change that unfolded post-independence, what was the investment of the upper caste women in that politics of nation building? At one level, it was in conformity with the roles that they had set themselves in pre-independent India, either as part of the All India Women's Conference or as those invested in social reform or in modernization and so on. So if you look at Women and the Planned Economy, a document that was put out in the 1940s, you see the voices of these women, of what one might call the quintessential Nehruvian woman. And I think in that process of nation building and that claim to a new secularity, there was also room for a measure of leavening one's demands with social justice, to an extent at least. And I think that generation of women also had felt responsible for their working class sisters in a certain, perhaps in a certain paternalistic way, but there was no way in which growth or change was possible without also simultaneously thinking of the poor, so to speak. Or as that by biblical saying would have it, the poor are always at your door and you can't ignore them. So there was that sense of being responsible. And then subsequently, of course, say from the 70s onwards, the middle class, upper caste feminist was outraged at what this Indian dream had turned out to be. It had turned out to be a sour dream. There was all this anger, the women's movement, the Nakshalites and all of that. And then again, this very uneasy sense of what do we own our less privileged sisters. And there was a sense that sisterhood is global at some level, and then working partially in terms of trade unions and in terms of thinking of an economic future where social and economic justice are possible and all of that. But in today's context, what you have is, especially in the neoliberal era after the 1980s, is a sense of entitlement and empowerment which appears to be located within a sense of the expanding female self, that I can do it as well as men could. I can be part of anything and prove that it's great. So there is an entire domain of writing, self-representation that has sort of made this possible. And while some of it is about achievement, as we all understand it, a lot of it is also about leaving the world as you find it. So basically, the flip side of achievement is, of course, it's great to have a woman stand up on an oil rig. And neither you nor I is going to be unhappy about that. We might even find it exciting. But having stood on the oil rig, I come back and marry within my caste class cluster, and then think that I'm actually push the boundaries of the social. I think that's where the problem lies. So how does one connect the standing on the oil rig with also a deep commitment to the workers who keep that oil rig going? At least there was an uneasy sense of I can't turn away from the workers in the 70s. But right now, with impunity, you can turn away. You can say that it doesn't matter. Because I think the whole question of equality and rights is defined within the framework of individual self-fulfillment. And that sense of fulfillment has acquired a particularly narcissistic edge in the era of social media. So that even if you want to claim that you're politically correct, it becomes an aspect of individual self-fulfillment rather than a sort of quiet, calm, reflective sense of maybe I learned by keeping my mouth shut for some time. Or that there are other things that I don't know, I must have the energy to know. So I think the neoliberal context has provided a certain class of women, especially from the Dvija communities, a way of proclaiming the importance of self-empowerment without concomitantly having to think of liberation in a wider sense, which is why the gender question has enjoyed a certain traction, which the caste question hasn't. Which is why it is easy for everybody to pick up the gender question, from CEOs to people in power. Whereas the caste question is always an uneasy question, even if it means that forget about engendering the caste question. Even the caste question per se, as it is present, becomes a very uneasy thing, because that immediately challenges that sense of entitlement in one way or the other. Whereas the gender question can be folded into a personalized sense of achievement, which the caste question can never be. No? You can never be a Brahmin achiever without owning up to your Brahminness. Whereas you can be a woman achiever just by being a woman. So there's that complicated thing. So I think it's a very important area of study, especially if you want to really ask questions about what is happening to a segment of society in which both state capital and private capital are invested to produce learners and workers, especially women. And what is their relationship to the rest of society? And as feminists, we must be interested in that question. So,
yeah, thank you. And if there are no questions, I call upon Arya Antarjanam to propose vote of thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. So we have come to the end of today's discussion on the topic, thinking social reproduction. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank the speaker, V. Geeta ma'am, for such a nuanced discussion on the topic. Thank you, ma'am, for the insights you have shared. I'm sure it would help us in taking the course forward. I would also like to thank Dr. Saujanya for organizing and moderating the talk. A big thank you to Monalika for making the brochure for the event, and Shweta ma'am for taking care of the technical and other background works. I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to Dr. Nilanjana Ray, Chairperson, School of Gender Studies, TIS Hyderabad, for the permission to organize the event, Senior Faculty Member Professor Gyan Mudra, and other faculty members of the school for being a part of this event. I would also like to thank the faculty from other schools who have joined us today. Finally, I would like to thank all the students and everybody else in the audience for your active participation in the discussion. Thank you, everyone, and have a nice week.
Thank you very much, Saujanya and TIS for this opportunity. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.